Welcome everyone. Today I'm going to talk about how you can use Azure function to automate some of the activities for your Azure subscription. So we'll use Azure function, and the use case we are talking about here is that you have a couple of virtual machines. Let's say you have VM1, VM2, VM3, and you need to only use this virtual machine, let's say between 9 a.m. up to 6 p.m. of your local time. So that's the time when the VM should be up and running. So ideally, from a cost optimization perspective, you need to shut down these VM after the work is over. Let's say put a buffer. So you start the VM in the morning, let's say around 8:30 hours, and then you shut that down at around, let's say, 18:30. So this whole duration between 16:30 to 8:30 is the hour you're not paying for the CPU and the RAM usage. Okay, so that's where the cost saving comes in. It saves a cost, a lot of cost, especially those if those VMs are heavy, memory intensive. They definitely will be able to save a lot of cost to your system. Hence, you need this kind of solution to help business do more investment in areas they can innovate on, which essentially means that they'll be able to help build other things for their end user, bring in additional experiences. So there are multifold benefits. Now to solve this use case, so if you consider this as a use case, what you can do, you can consider a couple of ways. One of the most used way is to use Azure automation. Okay, and you can actually use the runbook to create some runbook, and in fact there are runbooks available which can help you achieve that. So those are already available for you to pick and choose. We'll take another approach. So we will use something called Azure function, which is a serverless. So we'll use Azure function and we'll build a function. And we'll use the function in such a way that is close to what we have been doing from, let's say, an automation perspective. So we'll use a PowerShell based Azure function. And then we will write the simple PowerShell script to shut the VM and start the VM on time. So in fact, we only need to write the start script because the VM configuration nowadays has got something called auto shutdown. So you can enable auto shutdown at the VM level and then do the PowerShell um, start the VM on a time. So in Azure function, we have something called a timer based function. So it triggers in a specific time. So you can use cron jobs to define like how frequently that would occur. You can even say like I want to start at, let's say, 8:30. So cron job expression looks like a couple of stars. So if you have, let's say, 6 placeholders, for example, they are generally hour, minute, and second, something like that. And you define those things. So if you say like I want to start at, let's say, 8:30, it'll be starting at 8:30 in the morning. If you want to do it at 2 o'clock, so you do it something like that. So you basically define those things in the cron job to make sure that this understands when it needs to start, and use a timer triggered function to trigger the function on that specific time. So you don't have to define any kind of scheduler or anything of that sort. You can even take an approach of using logic amp, which is a timer trigger logic app, to say when that logic app should get triggered, and then call the function from the logic app if you have a generic function, which can be called from many different applications. So for example, you build a function to shut down a set of VM, but you call it from different things. So if you create a timer trigger thing, then it becomes a bit confusing. So instead of that, you create a simple function, HTTP triggered function, which can be called from anything which can run in a scheduled fashion like a logic app, and then you can do that. So let's see what we all need to do. Now, couple of things we need as a part of prerequisite. So let's define them one by one. You first need an Azure subscription. That's where you will be creating all the resources. So you need Azure subscription. And then secondly, you need a machine where you need a Visual Studio Code and a couple of SDK and tools to be installed. We'll see how we can install them, from where we can get them, and what approach I'm taking. I'm using WSL. You can use any Windows or Linux based machine and then install those tools over there. You will have to create an Azure function in Azure subscription and deploy the code over there. But before that, you need a couple of VM for testing. So we have got, let's say, 2 VMs created. We'll use them part of our testing process. So let's see the whole process, how that looks like in a nutshell. So let me switch back to my demo machine for a moment. Let me go back and open my Azure portal. Now, if you look into this Azure portal, the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a function app. So I'll go to resource group. I will choose a resource group which is I'm using. So let me say that VM snooze demo. So if you see that we have got 2 virtual machines already created, they're up and running over here. So you can see that stop button is enabled, start is disabled. That means it is started. So I can just go ahead and click stop, and it's going to go ahead and stop the VM. If I go into this thing, I can stop the other VM. I can even configure the auto shutdown, so I don't need any function app to shut the VM. So each VM I can specify which time I need to shut that down. So if I choose, let's say, the local time I'm working on, and then I choose that I want to, let's say, shut the VM at 18:30. I have to also always define in AM PM. So let's do that. So I'll say it will be 6:30 p.m. in the evening. I'm gonna enable the auto shutdown. I can also enable, if I enable the auto shutdown, when before it shuts down, it should drop me an email. You can do that. So the VM 0 is now stop mode. I will start the VM 1, so I'll go ahead and then stop it, and I stop the VM. I'm going to use the same resource group for this demo, and I'm going to create Azure function over here. So you are basically going to create a new entry for Azure function where your function code will be deployed. And we'll see how we can write that function code. So I'll say that Azure function app, and then it brings up the function app from the marketplace. I create the function app, and it is going to ask me a couple of things. What is the name? So if I say snooze VM, hopefully no one has created this name. So because it has to be uniquely available across all Azure subscription, so it is now available, which means I can use it. I can choose different runtime stacks. Since I'm going to use PowerShell, I can choose PowerShell, but you have got a couple of different options available. So if you are going to use, let's say, the API, REST API, you can either use .NET, Node, or Python and call the API from your function app to shut this VM down. What I'm using is the easiest option where the API is already configured, the power through PowerShell. We'll use the Azure PowerShell. It supports 7.2 and going to get deployed in EastUS. And I can choose either Linux or Windows depending on anything is fine because PowerShell core runs on both the platforms. So I'm going to go ahead and say storage. It is going to create a new storage, and then it is going to create enable a public access on, which means I should be able to do that. And it is going to also have an application inside to capture the log. And then I'm not going to enable it with the GitHub account. And I will say review and create, and everything is validated and kind of approved. I'll be able to create a couple of things by hitting the create button. The function app, the app service plan, um, and all those storage application inside and everything it needs for the function app to run, right? While this function app might take a couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to my Visual Studio Code and show you a few things. Now, function app does require SDK. So if I say Azure Function Tools download, you will get a option to download the Azure Function Tools. So it basically guides you from the documentation what tool do you need and how you can install it. So you can see that it gives you set of instruction. So you can go ahead and read that, which I spent a couple of hours to explore this when it was first announced, but I will show you a couple of ways by which you can install this pretty easily and quickly. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to open my Visual Studio Code, and I'm using my Windows subsystem for Linux. You can see that it is connected already running at the bottom left corner. But let's say you're opening it, you can say that WSL. Okay, can say connect to WSL. So I'm running a Windows subsystem or Linux in my local machine. I'm connecting my Visual Studio to that one. It comes as part of an extension so which you can enable, right? And this, then you can see that I'm directly into that machine, right? If I say ls, so you can see that this is actually going inside my WSL and exploring those folders. So I'm going to use that. And one more extension which you need is that Azure Tools. So if you type Azure Tools is the extension which basically brings in a lot of other extensions like app services, static web app, functions, storage, databases, virtual machine, container apps, and what you can also get is an ability to log into Azure from your Visual Studio Code. So if you notice here at this point in time, we are not logged into Azure. So otherwise in this purple color bottom bar, you will see the credentials showing up. So you need to log into Azure. Azure sign in. So you can see that this extension allows you to sign in to Azure portal using your credentials. So if you do that sign in, what essentially it does, it goes ahead and logs the Visual Studio machine, and you can see now my name is showing up at the bottom purple bar next to my Windows logo. That is, I'm logged into Azure using that credential, so I'm all fine. Now I need to build the Azure function, right? So to build the Azure function, since it is already installed, right? You can just open the command palette by Control Shift P and then say Azure Functions. You can see that it tells you that to create a new project. Now, before I create a new project, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a folder for this project. So I'll say mkdir yt demo func. S- I open the code inside that folder. So I'm going to close the previous one, and this opens in the same folder. So you will be able to see that folder showing up in my terminal. So I'm right now inside this folder. I'm good. And now I'm logged into Azure. So let me just remove this just to make sure that I'm logged into Azure. I create a sign in. It makes sure that I am now signed in. And I go ahead and close this. So what it shows up, and then I open the command palette by Control Shift P and say Azure Functions. Now I can create a new project. So let's just do that. So for the first time, you're going to create a new project in this folder. You will choose the runtime, which is PowerShell, and you can choose a timer trigger or HTTP trigger based on how you want to do that. There are other options available. I'll go ahead and choose the timer trigger, and I can say daily snooze. Okay, you can give any name, and then I hit enter. And what it essentially means is that every 5 minutes is gonna go ahead and execute it. So if I just change it to 2 minutes, so every 2 minutes, this function will get triggered and try to start the set of virtual machines it is going to start. So if I hit enter now, it's going to go ahead and create that because my tools are already installed in the WSL. Now, one of the things I wanted to tell you, for if you're using it for the first time, you can install the tool through Azure Function commandlet. If you say Azure Function, and you can see install or update Azure Function core tools. If you hit that, it will help you install the Azure Function Core Tool version 4, which is the latest one, into your development box where you have opened this Visual Studio Code. So in my development box is the WSL. If you're using local machine like a Windows or Linux machine, it'll be installing in that. So you don't have to, let's say, download, install the prerequisite, make sure all the components are there. You can use the Visual Studio command palette to really configure your Azure Function app. And you can see that it is kind finished saying that, and the tool version 1 is kind of configured and installed, right? So you notice a couple of files I wanted you to observe. First of all, the host.json, which talks about the function version it is using, and what else you need is the profile, which has got a line at line number 16, which tries to connect. So I'm gonna copy this and hide it. Okay, and I am going to add this data to the run.ps. But before that, you see that I have a timer trigger, schedule duration in every 2 minutes. This function is going to run. That's what this cron job really means. It's a standard definition. So if you need to explore about cron job, how you can run it every Monday to Friday between 8 at 8:30 a.m. Not on weekends. You can pretty much specify all those details through cron job. So I'm not going to take you through a journey through a cron job. It's a long one, but I'm gonna use this run command and add it outside of this. Now, what essentially it means is that function app needs to log into Azure, right? So it uses something like a system managed identity. We will see that in a while when the function app is created in Azure, how to configure that. But essentially, your code is going to use that identity to install to Azure. Now, with that means you need two things. The identity needs to have an access to do the stuff you want to do. So in this case, we're trying to start a VM. So you need to be part of a group called Azure Virtual Machine Contributor, to be able to do that. If you're not, then you will not allowed to start a VM. So we'll make you that, which means the identity will be added to that role. So let's see how we can do that if the function creation is done. So you can see that its deployment is complete. I go to the resources, the function app shows up, and I go into the identity of the function app. This is the prerequisite. You see that we have a system assigned, and I will switch it on. Okay. Once this I switch it on and save it, this is gonna enable the system assigned identity for the function app. Once this system assigned managed identity is created in the Active Directory, it'll be visible below, and you can actually go and use this role assignments button to assign the role to this identity. Otherwise, you can do it from the Azure portal, right? So right now, I don't have any role assigned. If you run the function app now, it's not going to work as expected. That means it's not going to um, start the VM which are stopped, right? So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and go to a subscription level maybe, and I can choose this, and I define a role virtual machine contributor. So this is the lowest level of access you can give to this user. That user will not have access to the overall subscription. So it's kind of the safe one. And it is saying that the role assignment is done. If I refresh it, should be fine. So we are good to go. So we have got this sub function app. We have got this identity enabled. We have this identity. So you can go ahead and check in the Active Directory. So I've got the users. Let me see if I can fetch that user. Uh, So it's a long path too. So we'll skip that. Okay. So but the overall idea is this function, um, which we just now have created. If I go back, WG Snooze VM, and if I go into this, so it is in this subscription running. Everything looks fine. Okay. So now I have got this function app already created. What I can do, I can simply go ahead and check if it is connecting to the Azure, and I can write a couple of lines to enable something like whether this VM can be started. Can I set a context? So first of all, you need to set the context. Once you log into the subscription, right, you need to set the context for this. So I have copied a context, that is my subscription ID and the tenant I'm going to connect to. And then I'm going to also say that I'm going to start, let's say start. This is a PowerShell command. So I'll say start AZVM, and then I can give a name, group name, and I can give the name of the VM. Okay, so I will pick these names from my resource group, and the VM I'm gonna point to this, and this is the resource group I'm gonna use. So I will use the VM name like this, and the resource group that is this one. Okay, so this is the resource group. So you can dynamically even pass these values once you have list of things to do. So ideally, you can use a logic app, create a function to get those values in a list kind of format and loop through it and call this function again and again, pass them as parameter. You can even parameterize them by using the param command, right? So you can do that as well. So what essentially these three lines are doing is that the line number 12 is going to log in using the managed identity with the rights to have a contributor access to a virtual machine, and it will set the context to this subscription and tenant, and then it is going to actually try to snooze the VM on. So if you have to do it for second VM, you just put the second line. Okay, so I can even write a command to pick up all the VMs dynamically from a resource group and then start all of them. I can do that. So it's all PowerShell stuff. So once this is kind of done, I'm gonna go ahead and also add a small thing which is prerequisite. So you have to enable that AZ CLI, AZ this thing for the PowerShell, right? It is going to go ahead and update that in the thing. And I'm going to use this command palette to say that function, and I say deploy to function app. Now, deploy to function app will pick up the list of, let's say, function app in that Azure subscription because I'm now logged into this machine. So you can see that WG Snooze VM is the one where I'm gonna deploy it, and it says that it will override everything previously done, so I'm fine with that. Um, there are two ways to develop Azure Function App. One is to go to the portal and use the portal designer, but that doesn't have a source code repository, which means essentially you cannot go back in history, roll back to a previous state. So use your conventional Visual Studio Code, connect it to a source control, deploy it from there so that you are not dependent on the Azure. So if you delete that function app from Azure portal, everything is gone. But here it stays with me in my local source code repository, or even I can put it in GitHub and keep it there. And you can see that in the output window, it is going to have a synchronization saying that this is going to get deployed over there. So with these things, you need, and it says that it's completed, right? And once it says that it is completed, what it essentially means that it basically has the function app up and running in Azure, right? So what this function app is going to do is let me open them side by side, is that if I now go back to the function, and I will be able to see the what all functions I have here inside this, and you can see that daily snooze has come up because I have uploaded it, and I can even see the total execution count. I don't think it has executed even for once because 2 minutes is not yet over. You can even monitor. You can go ahead and manually run it to test it, right? So that's where we can see the code and we can test it. So a couple of things will be visible just in case you are not sure if it is working fine. You can always run. So all my code has come here. If I run and test and say run, what it's basically going to do is that is going to get accepted and it will run that. Okay, I'll close it. And you can see that it is connected. The first download is in progress. Function app ran. So I potentially see no such issue over here. Let me maximize this window, and there is no error. If there is an error, it will clearly be visible here in the log, but I don't see any error, which makes me believe is that if I have this another tab to see the status of my virtual machines, which are in this subscription, which I targeted, should be now up and running because I manually stopped them. So I'm going to go to this home, go and say the virtual machines, and I am seeing them stopped. So it should be up and running because I tried to start them here. You can just wait for a couple of minutes. Maybe it is taking some time to start them, but let me see the execution count to check things out. You can even go to this function app, and you can see now this is kind of trying to show up that I just restarted the web app just to make sure that things are fine. So it should trigger in every 2 minutes and then try to start the VM, which are kind of stopped, right? So if you want to observe the way how it is working, right, it will have some number of calls happening, and that should be visible here inside each of the functions you have created, right? And it'll tell you like how many execution has happened, right? And if you notice here the monitor tab, which is what it gives you a bit more additional details of the function app, it'll tell you exactly if there are any execution happened. So far, no execution happened here, so you don't see things are showing up. But let's wait for 2 minutes, and it should be available. Just wanted you to view this similar function. So if I just go ahead and let's say open a function app which was kind of created a couple of hours ago, and then I show you the progress of that function app through monitor, which ran a couple of times. This is also similar to what you have seen here, that every 2 minutes you can see that you will see something like this log. And if there is a failure, it will tell you a failure. Otherwise, it is generally a success. And the duration to run that function app is visible here. You can even mention no wait. You can actually either synchronously do that or do it asynchronously. So the VM start command does allow those options so that it doesn't have to be so long. So you can see that it is going for a very long execution, which essentially could be an issue with the consumption-based function app, where there is a time limit of how long a function app should be able to run. If it is more than that time, then it will break. So if you, let's say, have 10 VM, each of them are taking, let's say, at least 3 minutes to start, then it is going to be half an hour, right? So why to do that? So you can just leave it, call an asynchronous start command from a PowerShell command and let it start. You don't wait until unless it is a sequential start process. And then function app will be pretty quick. We can also consider that option with a switch. Right, so to explore all those details, you can explore it from the Cloud Shell by running your code, right? So you can use the PowerShell mode, and it will open up PowerShell all configured, installed. You don't have to really run anything over there. So you can do pretty much. Let me check my snooze function. You can say start VM, and you can see that it gives me a couple of options, right? The resource group, etc. So it basically tells me all the things it might need. So for example, if I say, and I just say that, or G demo, you can also do one thing, say get help start AZVM, and it basically talks about like what all things you get, right? So it starts as your VM. You can use this no wait. So no wait essentially allows you to call asynchronous, and if you use this no wait and confirm both switch, it will not stop. So a lot of time you probably the tool, especially for shutdown, the confirmation is important. So you explicitly confirm those things. You must use these two uh, things uh, on your own. So that's what it must do that. So you can actually go ahead and see what exactly is happening into this monitoring tool. So with this, you can see that the function app is getting triggered on a regular interval, right? And if you look into this function, which is already created, which ran for a couple of times, that is similar to what we have done here. So just to show you the code, there is no change in the code, and you will be able to find, like, if you notice here in the code, we are also doing the same thing. We are calling an identity, setting the context and running it. And if you notice here in the function app, we have got the identity section where we enable this thing, and we basically go into the role assignment and enable the roles here, and you basically see the contributor role is visible over here. So basically the whole idea of the function app to control your Azure subscription is you need to have the proper rights enabled. If it is not there, it's not going to work. So you may need to doubly make sure that your role assignments are visible, so you can see that you have this contributor rights showing up here for the resource name for the subscription for this resource, and once it is visible, then your function app should be okay to go, and you just deploy the code and this will work as expected, right? So this is what I want to talk about. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.